Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation's Lunch and Learn series. Today we have Dr. Andrew Mowen joining us. Dr. Mowen is a professor at Penn State University in Recreation, Parks, and Tourism Management. Welcome, Andy. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, great to be here today, Marcy.
We really appreciate you joining us, and on very short notice, so we extend our gratitude. So just to start, can you tell our viewers a little bit about what your work and the research that you do through Penn State?
Sure, thanks, Marcy. Well, in addition to what I do, obviously I'm on the faculty at Penn State, and I teach courses in park management, facility operations. So I do teach a number of undergraduate and graduate level courses, but also I'm supposed to be doing research and service. And a lot of my research really centers around how local park and recreation opportunities can be maximized to benefit the communities that they serve, they provide for. And really, my research focuses on two main aspects. The first is the health value or the health contributions of parks and recreation. And the second is how we invest in parks and recreation in order to achieve some of those health benefits. For example, we know that parks are good for people inherently, and they're good for mental health, physical health, well-being, anxiety reduction. A survey that I was involved with a couple years ago that polled Pennsylvanians found that a majority of Pennsylvanians agree that parks, trails, and open space are an essential component of our healthcare system. And that's important to know, particularly in these times, in terms of what parks and recreation can do for our community.
Was that a small majority or a large majority? When you say a majority of Pennsylvanians?
Yeah, it was pretty large. It was around 70%. And what was interesting about that is we followed up and we wanted to see whether there were certain demographic groups that were more or less likely to agree with that sentiment. And we really found uniform support for it across different income levels, across different communities geographically, across rural, suburban, urban areas there. So it was a pretty uniform assessment there. Pennsylvanians get it. They understand the value of their parks, both locally, but also, at the state level too.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of use in our state parks and state forests, as well as community parks during COVID-19. And I remember a piece of research you had done a while back that said one of the number one reasons that people spend time in the outdoors is for stress reduction. Mm-hmm. So I imagine that's part of the reason that we're seeing a lot of use of parks and forest.
Sure. It's a severe case of cabin fever, and certainly parks are part of the prescription for that.
Yes, I would agree. I felt that myself. So you talked about some of your research relates to understanding the value of investing in outdoor recreation and parks. Can you tell to the viewers a little bit about what you found? What is that value?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's interested me for many years, because a lot of times you don't hear a lot of conversation surrounding the economics of parks. And by economics of parks, I don't just mean what they can do for communities economically. We can talk about that a bit later. But the fact that parks, they're not a free good. It does take a significant, although not terribly onerous, investment of money, capital, people to operate our community parks well and in a safe manner. So it's not something like there's a park and it just runs itself. It doesn't work that way. And so investing in parks, the more that a community can invest in their parks, either through investing in the facilities there, the people that operate the programs, the volunteer network within that community, the more a community invests in that, the better the parks are. The better the parks are, the more they're used. The more they're used, the more health benefits, the more helpful outcomes will occur from that. And there have been a lot of studies that have examined this. They've examined the extent to which a community invests in its park system. Obviously, communities that invest more in that tend to realize the highest health gains. A study by the Trust for Public Land they have this metric. It's called Park Score, and it's designed for their cities primarily. It's the largest cities, and it's based on a composite index of access and amenities and how close the parks are to people. And what they found is cities with higher park scores have healthier people, even while controlling for sociodemographic, socioeconomic characteristics. So that's a pretty strong statement, knowing that a community that invests in its parks, its trails, its open space, its recreation programs, it's not only likely to attract people interested in that, but it's also to make the residents there who have already lived there healthy.
Which, even though we're talking about health, there's economics in that, because if you have a healthier population, you have fewer lost work days, you have less insurance needs because the people are healthier.
Yeah.
So even when we're talking health, we're talking economics as well.
Yeah, the health savings, and that's the hidden cost. You don't often see the health savings. You see what's spent, and we as a society often try to figure out ways to cut spending, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we don't see what could have been spent because of what we already have. A lot of times the preventive services that we have in our community really goes unrecognized. So for example, again, looking at outdoor recreation in Pennsylvania, the fact that we have these opportunities here, both our state parks, our state forest system, our local, our county parks, those allow opportunities for people to be physically active. And we know there's a strong connection between your physical activity level and healthcare expenditures. I mean, I would estimate that within, at least 50 to 100 million in terms of health cost savings to Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and you're right. We don't necessarily factor that in, because we have a lot of people that are engaging in the outdoors. You mentioned that people correlate access to outdoor recreation with their part of their wellness program and their health program. How do they feel about their parks in general? I mean, have you done any research to see how people feel about community parks, state parks, access to the outdoors?
Well, I can certainly tell you at a state level, our Pennsylvania State Park system is one of the best in the nation, and there's a strong level of support. Pennsylvania is there's a strong sense of ownership with your state parks and your state forests, because they're relatively close to a lot of communities. I mean, we have at least 120 in this state, which is pretty significant. But overall, people feel that they have memories of their families, memories of past trips that they've taken there. There's a fair bit of nostalgia, but also there's a renewed interest in that. I mean, we're at this weird place in time in our society where sports is kind of on hold. Some of those public spaces that we normally would go to socialize and to be with people are not allowed to be open or operated in the way they were yet. And so people are flocking to their parks and looking to parks as a way not only to get exercise, but to see other human beings, right? And communities that have parks that are designed such that you can physically distance and recreate are doing quite well, and people are rediscovering them. So to answer your question, we love our parks, but getting back to the root of the work that I do, which is, do we love them enough that we invest in them over other things that we need to invest? There's an old saying, which is first in our hearts, last in our pocketbooks. And that certainly applies to local parks. It's not seen as something as dire or vital to us. And so oftentimes they go uninvested unless there's a significant safety problem at a park.
Yeah, and we're seeing that at a state park and state forest level as well. We have $1 billion need for maintenance and infrastructure, and some of that is our safety concerns. So yeah.
And I think Pennsylvanians, and this is particularly true at a local level, they see their parks, they're in pretty good shape, at least what you can see, and they love their parks. They just assume that their local leaders are investing in them. And that may be the case, or that may not be the case in terms of the inner workings where the budget, how the budget pie is split up and where investment goes into.
Yeah, right. Which is maybe one reason people need to be active and in their community and in this within the state,
Yeah.
talking about their support. We had a question that popped up that I'll jump over to. Michelle asked, where do you think is the most park healthy area in Pennsylvania, maybe by city or county? Do you have a thought on that?
Well, Michelle, very, very good question. I certainly would say that the southeast portion of Pennsylvania and then some of the urban areas have some of the have more parks, certainly, and more opportunities. That's where most of the population is. But you can go to rural areas as well, and it depends on how you define a park, for example, because there's a lot of forest, there's a lot of open space that people can use as well. It's not necessarily as programmed as, for example, some of the parks in the eastern part of the state are. So I would be very hesitant to say, well, these are the best parks. I would say that the parks that have the best leadership in terms of directors and supportive local officials and budgets to some extent tend to be the better systems. But I would hate to say, well, then these places are not so good because we've got all shapes and sizes throughout Pennsylvania. One point I do want to make, however, and that is I haven't always lived in Pennsylvania. I was born and raised in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. I live in Center County now. But I did work in Cleveland, Ohio, in Cuyahoga County for a couple years for the Cleveland Metro Parks District, which is a fabulous park system, award-winning park system. And what I learned about that was that it had funding that was dedicated to the operation of those parks. Now, obviously, the citizens of Cuyahoga County had to vote on that every 10 years, whether they were going to continue to support their park system. But it was dedicated funding, and that dedicated funding really allowed that park district to do quite amazing things. So thank you for that question. Very good question.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because when you have dedicated funding and you know how much money is coming in on a regular basis, you can plan. And I think that's key to running an efficient park system or forest. You alluded a little bit to that parks and recreation have economic value. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how it has economic value?
Yeah, and I'll talk about it in terms of historically the economic value, because I think that calculation is changing a little bit temporarily because of the pandemic. But what we do know, there's two main economic draws for a park and recreation system. The first relates to quality of life. So if you look at a community, obviously you're going to look for good schools, you're going to look for job opportunities, you're going to look for good restaurants, you name it. But quality of life is this larger term, and sometimes that entails whether it's conducive to the hobbies, the activities that a resident wants. In many cases, it could be trails, it could be sport venues, sport fields, playgrounds. So parks provide that quality of life, which helps to attract businesses. It helps to attract businesses, it helps to attract workers, and that helps the tax base of a community, and it also helps attract economic activity. So there's a draw from residents coming to a community because not only does it have all those great schools and good businesses, but it's got a great park system with it, right? It's very hard to find all of those places without a good park system. Then there's the other side of the coin, which is looking at the non-residents. It's looking at the tourists, the people that might come for a sport tournament, or they're coming to see some type of a venue there. And parks and recreation, while they may not be the local parks, may not be the thing that draws people in, they certainly recreate those areas while they're visiting and they're spending their money. That brings new money into an area. And our state park system, for example, is an illustration of that. So, for example, Pennsylvania, and this was a study that was done in around 2010, 2012, so probably needs updated at some point. But it found that for every dollar that Pennsylvania as a state invested in its state park system, $12 was returned to the Commonwealth in terms of revenue and spending from visitation, state park visitation, and that includes people coming from outside Pennsylvania to come to our state park system and spend.
Yeah, and that's a pretty impressive return.
Yeah, it's a pretty solid return looking at that.
Yeah, $1 in, $12 back. And I would imagine because you have that economic impact, you're also supporting jobs in communities surrounding state parks.
Yep, you're supporting jobs in the service sector. I think that's why there's been a lot of interest in making sure that we have our state parks open safely now to support the local businesses around them.
Yeah, great. I was just looking, a couple of things popped up here. We have Nettie who loves all of our parks. We're with you there. And Ed says that, he'd love to see more native plants and trees in our parks. There's been a significant loss of trees over the years. And that's very true. We've had hemlock woolly adelgid, we've had the emerald ash borer, we've had diseases that have impacted our parks. And does vegetation play a role in a value of a park?
It certainly does in terms of what that vegetate. I mean, obviously, from an ecosystem service perspective, yes, native plants is good for the integrity of the environment. But if you're looking at more outdoor recreation needs, having natural vegetation, when I say natural, native, non-invasive, certainly is better for some of our activities, for birding, for example. And it's easier to maintain those things. And so I think that there's definitely been a resurgence of Pennsylvanians' awareness of these native species and how you can balance those things out. So vegetation is good. We're not quite there yet with, like, for example, I own property that has way too much multiflora rose on it. And people come to visit like, that looks great. Yeah, it looks great, but probably not ideal for the area there. And so I think we still have a ways to go as far as educating some Pennsylvanians about this, but we're getting there. And we're certainly getting there when it comes to, streamside restoration too.
Yes, riparian areas. They're very important. And our knowledge base has changed because there was a time when we recommended multiflora rose,
right?
And now we realize that it's invasive and could have a negative impact. We have Greg who said he's an avid believer in parks and recreation, and Shay, hopefully I'm pronouncing it properly, is interested in how a park department might measure or calculate their economic impact. Is there kind of an in-house way that they can calculate it if they're trying to defend why why the investments are important?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and that's something that it's going to depend on the community that's agency serves and the type of agency it is in terms of what types of parks it has, what types of programs. I would say that if you are more of a suburban park and recreation system that runs a lot of camps and sporting programs, you're a little bit more on the active recreation side of things. I would look at visitor spending in the area. I would look at people that come from outside of the area as a way of saying of telling the story of your economic impact. If you're in an area where you have parks and recreation, but it's primarily for the local community, you need to think more in terms of those indirect benefits as health benefits that I talked about, and how the services that you have, like there are calculations to say, okay, we know how many people are in our parks, we know how much physical activity they have, and if you have this much physical activity, there's a calculation for health cost savings that you can put into that formula. And so you can present it that way. It really depends, it really depends on the priorities of your individual community and the priorities of your elected body. That's really where I would direct the type of economic impact that you do there. For Pennsylvania state parks, it made sense to look at visitor spending because we know that in addition to the wildlife and the natural benefits of state parks, we also know that they support a lot of businesses around the state parks. And so we looked at visitor spending with that study.
Yes. Um, Outdoor recreation in Pennsylvania, we're like the fifth largest consumer spender in the nation at over $29 billion.
Mhm.
So it does have a significant economic impact. For folks who might want to delve a little bit deeper into that sort of calculation, is there a study that you might be able to share with us that we can add a URL to
Absolutely.
the
Yeah,
comment
absolutely.
box, and they can dig a little bit deeper on their own? Uh,
Absolutely.
our talk about plants and trees led to a question of, a green space, open space, parks translates into more permeable areas
Mhm.
and perhaps better for stormwater management. Are you hearing a lot of discussion as it relates to using parks for MS4 control and that as a value to having parks because it could be less expensive than putting in a whole new stormwater system?
I think we're seeing a lot of movement in that area. We're seeing it particularly in eastern Pennsylvania, where the problems are a little bit more pronounced with the watersheds there. But there has to be an education campaign with it so that people understand that we're part of a greater system here. And, the parks are our sponge, so to speak, our filters. Um, so that's where I see that going. But it's got to be something that is thought at the beginning of a project, whether you're doing a park renovation, et cetera, and not something as an add-on at the end.
Yeah, little foresight and open space protection comes into that as well.
Mhm.
We have a good infographic that we'll post to the Facebook page later as well that looks at some of those economic values from ecosystem services, which you mentioned, stormwater management, health. So just some little snippets of information that are interesting talking points. You mentioned or alluded to the fact that we're seeing some differences in how people interact with their state parks and forests and their community parks during COVID-19. Has there been any research on that? And what's being found? How
Yeah,
are people relating?
there has been some early research on that since March 11th, which is when the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared the pandemic. And that was done by an organization called Leave No Trace in cooperation with Penn State. I'll make sure that you get the link to that study and what it
Great,
found
thank
in
you.
terms of people's expectations and their behaviors. The main takeaway is people are using their parks more now. Um, we were on stay-at-home orders, most of the Commonwealth, for quite some time. But getting physical activity was one of those essential services. I don't want to say services, but it was one of those activities that you were allowed to do. You were allowed to go to your local park and recreate. And so people took great advantage of that. Now, with that, of course, you're drawing crowds, and some of the parks aren't necessarily, I mean, they may be smaller parks. They may have smaller parking lots. They may be designed in a way that makes it difficult to physically distance. And so what people will do is they might park not in the parking lot, away from the parking lot. Well, that creates an impact. That creates an impact on the infrastructure. If people are spread out, what we know is if you're bringing your trash with you and you're not taking it back, where does it go? So we're starting to see trash problems in our parks because of this dispersal of use. Now, most of these things that I'm hearing are more anecdotal because we're still fairly early on with this. So I think one thing that we know, and we know this from the Google mobility reports too, is that park use has skyrocketed in the last 2 months. I think that will sustain. That will sustain as people are realizing the benefits of that. And if we can make sure that these places that we go to that are not just for humans, but if these places that we visit are not just there for our physical exercise but are a place that we can enjoy being at. I worry that some of the establishments that we start to shop at, if we're going to a department store or we're going back to a home improvement store, there's a lot of social control that's taking place at those places, rightly so. And I'm worried that while we need to behave well in our parks, I still want people to have fun when they're there. If people aren't having fun, or if there's too many conflicts because there's disagreements on how people should use the parks, people aren't wearing masks, they're not staying far enough apart. That's counterintuitive to the purpose of our public spaces and our parks. And then those are my opinions. There's no research into that latter stage, but I'm curious as to how Pennsylvanians will feel about visiting their parks this summer.
Yeah, and it is interesting because we have seen some trash and some vandalism, and we have been given permission in the counties that have gone yellow to start bringing our volunteers back to address some of those issues. So we're going to be releasing some of those cleanup dates. Pennsylvania Park and Forest Week is May 23rd to May 30th, and so we're going to be looking at doing some mitigation during that time period. And you have some people that have been very good stewards of our lands, and they're out there picking up trash when they're out for a walk. But there has been some impacts. You made a comment about the essential nature of having access to parks and recreation. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I feel that sometimes we don't view them as essential, which is why maybe when we're making budgeting decisions, we move them to a lower tier of priority.
Right. It's because of the hidden cost of it all. I mean, mental health, a person's fulfillment there, just being in nature and having clean air and seeing things that provide human happiness. It's not something that you have a tangible, yes, this helped me in this way. It helped me make another dollar, or it helped me lose a pound. But it's something that can help, and it's not the only thing, but it's something that can help one cope with a changing world, an uncertain world. And so I really view these public spaces as essential because not everyone has access to, a giant property where they can quarantine for weeks. People need these public spaces to get out, get their exercise, be in nature. That's how we were designed as humans. And, sometimes that's not really seen as, well, that's nice to have. I put it this way. And this is after some studies that I've done with natural disasters. Obviously, we are in more of a public health crisis than a natural disaster. But I've done work in New Orleans after Katrina. I've also done work up in Long Island after Superstorm Sandy. And the question is often posed by local officials when having to make real tough budget decisions, because the public dollar and people's willingness to spend obviously is limited in those times. But the question is, do we really need our parks? Are parks and recreation all that important based on what we're dealing with right now? And it's a shocking answer that I give to them is no. Communities can certainly forego investment in parks. We don't need them to live, to breathe, to eat, to have shelter. We don't need them. But it would sure suck to live in a community without that. Okay. They're something that it helps a community get through tough times. And so, yeah, a community can certainly forego investment in parks, but it wouldn't be much in existence for the residents of those communities. And you'd certainly probably lose some good people to other communities that have better amenities.
Right. And you also then lose some of the environmental services provided by parks too, which are important. You touched a little bit on health, and we talked a little bit about stress relief. Are there other ways that parks help us from a health perspective? Can you just touch on them very briefly?
Sure. And one has gotten a little complicated here recently because of the physical, social distancing, right? And that is parks and public spaces. I mean, human beings are social creatures, and they offer a venue to do things as family, as a community. You're part of something larger than yourself. So when we talk about health, we also include socialization. We include meeting with your neighbor. We include that off conversation with a stranger that the only thing you may have happen to share is your love for that park or nature or that space. And so that's another important element that we have. And I do think that people are going to public spaces just to see other people. They may realize after a couple of minutes that maybe they were better off not, but they are going to be around other families, and that is an important, I think, service that a public space like a park does. You know, it's like-minded people. If you're on the trail, there's other trail users. You're part of a certain group. If you're in an RV park camping, you're part of a group there. We're group affiliated beings. Now, of course, that's going to be challenged in terms of how we do that in a way that's safe, is healthy, and also enjoyable too. So I think, you know, a good deal of tolerance and kindness is needed for our fellow park goers as we get into a heavy visitation season coming up here.
Yeah, and as temperatures start to heat up.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in the inherent creativity of people, and the inherent kindness of people, and I think that we'll see some new ways of interacting and enjoying our parks and forests in a way that's safe and sustainable.
Absolutely, you're going to see a lot of creative approaches developed in the coming weeks.
Yes. Andy, are there other thoughts that you'd like to share with us? I didn't see any new questions pop up, but are there other things that maybe you'd like to share that I was remiss in asking of you?
Well, I guess the only other thought that I have, you know, with this is it's not that even though I study parks and recreation, I teach classes that focus on the effective administration of people and natural resources, etc. We don't operate in a vacuum. We do have other community services, businesses, healthcare providers that are important, and we need to continue to find ways to partner with them to help those organizations and businesses with their needs as well. Because, you know, we're all in this together, as we've been hearing. And so I would encourage those of you that support parks to think of ways that parks can help the healthcare community, and they can help also the local businesses and vice versa.
Yeah, again, putting on that creative thinking cap. That's good advice, Andy. I appreciate that. We have several people expressing their gratitude for you being here today, and for your research that you continue to do. We do appreciate you coming here and sharing your knowledge. You have a vast knowledge base. We have made a commitment to sharing a few links with people. So if you share those with me, we will upload them so people can have access to the studies, or to help them better understand how they might calculate the value for their local park if they're making a case for funding. But Andy, I really appreciate your time and all your energy and your passion for our state parks and our community parks. Your work is very important to the work that we do. So thank you for being with us here today, and have an incredible, next couple of days. I remember you mentioned you're going to be doing some spring gobbler, so good luck with that.
Yep, I'll be up in Clearfield County, so just getting outdoors and honing some of my birding skills there. So
excellent.
Thanks again for having me. I hope everyone has a great week, and eager to share those resources for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Okay, end the broadcast.